we are starting a brand new series today called Major Problems, Minor Profits. I have 3 kids. You know that if you've been here. It was probably 4 or 5 years ago, 4 years ago when it was just Brooklyn, Savannah. I decided to take them one day to McDonald's. So we all went to the car. We went to McDonald's. If you're from here, we went to the McDonald's off Longgate. Has a really big play place, so that's why we went to that one. And we were there, and I got their food, and they were playing, and then they came down and they ate and went back to play, and I'm just kind of hanging out. It was crowded. Like, there were so many kids, so many parents, and I'm just kind of on my phone or I'm doing a little bit of work, and then eventually it gets to the point where, like, all right, we got to go. So I start yelling up at them, and either they didn't hear me, so I'm going to assume the best of my kids, or they willingly ignored me, one of the two. So I just keep yelling up there, hey, Brooklyn, Savannah, we got to go. And they're just playing. Brooklyn, Savannah, we got to go. And people started to notice that I'm, like, trying to get them. So some parents are kind of trying to help, like, hey, come on down. And they decide they're not coming down. So I had to crawl up there, and I used to be a lot more flexible than I used to be. And I'm, like, crawling up, getting kids out of my way. And come on, guys, you got to come. And they came, and I'm getting Brooklyn's shoes on. And then I turn around to get Savannah's shoes on. I didn't realize she was right here. So when I turned around, I just ran her over. And she fell. And if you know Savannah, she isn't the quiet child, okay? She's my loud child. So she started screaming, crying at the top of her lungs, just boo-hoo crying. So now people are starting to notice what's happening. And I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, honey. And so I had a diaper bag on. I went to go pick her up. And when I bent over, I had a water bottle right here that poured all over Brooklyn. So now Brooklyn's crying. So now I'm like, oh, this is a disaster. So now everyone's looking at me now because I have 2 kids that are just crying. One is soaking wet and one is hurt. So I'm like, we gotta, like, in my head, I'm like, let's just get out of here. I'm never gonna see these people again. So I pick up the wet child, grab the other child, and I see a door. So I go straight to that door. What I didn't know about that door was that it was an emergency exit door with a big sign that said, alarm will go off if you open this door. I didn't see it. So I open it. And the loudest alarm I've ever heard is, and now, it's not my 2 kids crying. It's every kid in the McDonald's play place is crying. And there's one person who has made every kid cry, just me. There's parents who are trying to help me get my kids down, who are now looking at me like, I'm going to murder you. What are you doing? And I, with those kids, I saw them crying. I said, no, this is an emergency. And I left the emergency door. It was already going off. And I left. Sometimes in life, it feels like everything is just falling apart around you, doesn't it? Where it feels like everything is just one thing after another, like you just can't catch up. It's just like this happens, and then another thing happens, and before you know it, it's like your whole world is falling apart. And throughout this series, we're going to be talking about a lot of those issues that some of us have when the world is falling apart in our Major Problems, Minor Profits series. What's exciting about this series is that this is our joint series. Every year, if you've not been here, every year in October, we do a series along with 2 other churches, City on Hill Community Church, which is my brother's church in Columbia, and New Beginning Nazarene Church, which is a church in Mount Airy. Both those churches supported us, as in they helped us start this church. Both of those churches have great pastors. Both those churches are awesome. So what we are doing is we are doing this series with them. So they are both preaching on the same thing I'm preaching about today. I will be here next week talking about a different minor prophet. And the week after, Brian Remsch, Pastor Brian from New Beginning, will be here to preach to you. And then the week after that, my brother, Pastor Shane, will be here to preach to you. So you're going to get a bunch of different people speaking to you. I'm going to be going to their churches to preach. And we love doing this series. It reminds us that we are not alone in this, and we're not just one church, but we are partnering with other churches in our district, in our denomination, in our community. And so I'm excited, and I love doing this series each year. Today, we are talking about the book of Habakkuk. The book of Habakkuk. In the Bible, there are 3 major prophets. 3 major prophets that a lot of us might know. It's Elijah, it's Isaiah, and Jeremiah. You maybe have read those. If you've ever been to a Christmas Eve service, you've definitely heard Isaiah. But then there's all these minor prophets that most of us have never read, that most of us don't even know much about. And Habakkuk is what we're talking about today. It's only 3 chapters long. It's a very, very short book. But what I like about Habakkuk is it really talks about something that we all tend to go through, even though it was written so long ago. In fact, it was written between 1612 and 589 BC. Habakkuk at this time was the prophet of Judah. So back then, the Israelites, which were God's chosen people, this is the Old Testament, this is before Jesus. God's chosen people were divided into 2 nations, north as in kept the name Israel, then the south, which is Judah. So Habakkuk is the prophet for Judah. That means he is the person who talks for God and talks to God for the people. Habakkuk, is writing this book. And if you take all 3 chapters, it almost feels like 3 different acts of a play. So each chapter kind of tells us something different. Here's what chapter 1 tells us. You can write this down in your impact cards if you would like. Chapter 1 is all about wondering. Wondering. The people in Judah were, at this point, an embarrassment to the name of God. They were very wicked. They weren't living the way they were supposed to live. They were an embarrassment to God. They lived the complete opposite way of how they were called to live. So Habakkuk, being the prophet, the one that's speaking for God, the one that is representing God to these people, is upset. He sees all these people, he's upset about what he sees, that they are not living the way they should. And he starts calling out to God, asking God for help. And here's what he says in Habakkuk chapter 1, starting in verse 2. How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrong? You know what Habakkuk is doing here? He's questioning. God, why? Why aren't you listening? Where are you? I see all this wickedness happening. I keep calling to you, but you are not showing up. God, where are you? He is wondering why God doesn't seem to be doing anything. God, are you even listening to me? Just this week, I was talking to a guy who was at my house who has been going to church for his whole life, and he was asking me the same question. So I said, hey, how's everything going? He's like, I'm not doing well. My faith is really rocky. I keep asking God where he is, and he told me some things that's happening, and I don't feel like he's ever listening to me. I don't know if he's even there. And he just went on and on. Some of us feel that way now. God, where are you? Habakkuk is going through what I'm going to call a crisis of belief, or you can say a crisis of faith. You see, what Habakkuk believes with his heart doesn't match what he sees with his eyes. He believes that God is sovereign. He believes God is there, but he looks out at all these people in Judah, and he doesn't see it with his eyes. And that is his challenge. It's a lot of our challenges. The best way I've heard this explained is a concept called the dip. So Seth Godin wrote a leadership book, and he talked about this concept called the dip. And then I heard Craig Rochelle, who's a pastor, who talked about this concept of the dip in relation to Habakkuk. So here's what it looks like. Here's what I'm going to call the dip. I wanted this so it can be a little higher, so I didn't bend over too far to see it. So this is what the dip looks like. So for a lot of us, if you are here and you would say you are a follower of Jesus, this is your starting point. You eventually enter into a relationship with Jesus. You enter into that relationship, and things are going well. You feel connected. You understand it more. And then also, before you know it, you're on a spiritual high. Just things are going well. Every time you come to church, you hear a sermon. It's like, that sermon was just for me. Or you are reading your Bible, and this passage really spoke right to my heart. You get in the car and you put a worship song on. It's like, this is the song I need to write in this moment. You're praying to God. Everything's going well. You get to a point where you're at a spiritual high and things are going so well. You are in love with God. Your faith is stronger than ever. And you're like, yeah, this is awesome. You go to the mall and there's a spot open right for you. You're like, yes, God, thank you. And you pour into that spot. You get a raise at work. Everything is going really well. That's what a lot of us do. But then what tends to happen over time is that sermon that was used to connect with us so much, all of a sudden, not as much. Or that song that you used to hear, and now you come and you're like, I don't even know if I like these songs. Or life isn't as good. Your marriage was really strong, but now it's not as strong as it used to be. Your kids were really doing well, but now they're seeming to walk away. And then we get to this point here where I'm going to call a crisis of belief. This is where Habakkuk is, questioning, God, where are you? What are you doing? And some of us get here, and here's what a lot of us like to do when we get to this point, crisis of belief, where we feel like God's not talking to us like he used to, God's not connecting with us like he used to be. Normally, we try to do one of two things. We just go, I'm just going to try to get back to here. If I can get back to that spiritual high moment, that feeling I used to have, then everything will be good. I just need to get back to that spiritual high moment. But what that is, it's called denial. You're denying the fact that you are in a crisis of belief. We try to just ignore it. It's like, I know there's something there. I'm just going to leave that rock there. I'm not going to lift up to look at those questions and those doubts. So I'll leave it there. I'm going to pretend like everything's fine. I'm going to pretend like I'm good to go. And we try to go back there, which we can't even do. But what some of us do, instead of doing that, we go, you know what? If that's who God is, I don't believe him anymore then. Because where is he? Things were going so well, and now all of a sudden, he's not there anymore, so we try to go back here to the beginning. This is where we are in chapter 1. Chapter 1, Habakkuk is wondering, God, where are you? Where are you? I mean, look at Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 5. Look what it says. Look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed. This is God talking back to Habakkuk. For I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. So Habakkuk is crying out to God. He's in this wondering point, and God goes, I'm going to amaze you. And Habakkuk's probably like, yeah, I like this. I want to hear this amazing. I'm ready to be amazed by God. And look how God responds to Habakkuk. Verse 6. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwelling places not their own. They are feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like a vulture swooping to devour. They all come bent on violence. At this point, Habakkuk's like, wait. What'd you say? Because our people are wicked. Our people are doing pretty bad things. But you're going to send the Babylonians, who are worse than us, to come and take us over? Wait, this is how you're answering my prayer? Said, God, I'm worried about these people, but the Babylonians are way worse than that. You're going to send the Babylonians to us? This doesn't make sense, God. He's in the dip. He has a crisis of belief. Then he hears from God when he questions God, and the response he gets is not the answer he wants. Like, this is worse. I'd rather not even hear from you than hear this answer. And that's some of you right here. Some of you, you've been trying to have that child. You keep asking God, but yet you keep not having that kid. You're at a crisis of belief. Some of you, your marriages are rocky, and they're not getting any better. You're at a crisis of belief. Some of you, you got a bad call from your doctor, and you keep praying for healing, but you're still there. You still don't feel right. Some of you are questioning God, and you feel like he isn't responding, and when he responds, he's not giving you the answer you want. You are here at a crisis of belief. That is chapter 1. That is chapter 1. Listen to how Habakkuk responds to God. He says this in verse 12. O Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, will we not die? O Lord, you have appointed them to execute judgment. O Rock, you have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrong. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? God, why are you doing this? He is questioning God. And here's what I want you to understand with chapter 1. You can express questions and faith at the same time. That's what Habakkuk is doing here. He's questioning God, and he still has his faith. You need to understand that. Because sometimes I think we think that we can't actually question God. We can't give him our doubts, and if we do, it's because we don't have enough faith. I would say the opposite. When you question God, that means that you are trusting that he is who he says he is, and you're not sure why he's acting the way he is. Habakkuk is questioning, but he still has faith. He's in chapter 1. He is there. He is wondering. Some of you are here, but chapter 2 shows up. In chapter 2, we see waiting. Chapter 1 was all about wondering. Chapter 2 is waiting. Habakkuk is mad. He doesn't understand why God is allowing the Babylonian people that are worse than Judah, to do this, to conquer them. It doesn't make sense to him, so he tells God that. He complains to God about God's own plan. That's what he does. Then Habakkuk what he does next is crucial. Verse 1 in chapter 2. I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. You know what Habakkuk is doing? He gives his complaint, and he's waiting and listening. He's waiting for the answer. He's listening for the answer. You know what my problem is? I hate listening. Like, I understand it's important. That's why I want all of you to do it. I don't want to listen. I was at a wedding yesterday, and someone was explaining to me the difference between active listening, and passive listening, because they were trying to tell me I was passive listening, and I was like, no, I wasn't doing either. I just wasn't listening at all the way you were saying. It was my sister talking, to be fair, but I was like, I'm sorry, I didn't hear a single word you said. So I don't like listening. And that's what we're called to do at times. Listen and wait. The question I get a lot is, well, how do you know if God's speaking to you? And I'm going to give you a bunch of ways that God speaks. God can speak directly to you. You can have times where you are praying or you're just being quiet and you're just in the presence of God and you just hear something that you just don't know where it comes from. Maybe it's your conscience, maybe it's the Holy Spirit speaking to you, but that can happen. That has happened. I know people that's happened to. It's happened to me. I get it. And you might say, well, that's just your own thoughts, or it could be something else. God can directly speak to you, but God also speaks to you through his word. When you read scripture, you'll do it at times, and you've probably done it, where you'll read and all of a sudden something hits you, a verse that you've read a million times, and you read it again, and you're like, wait a second, this is a little different this time. God will speak to you through his word. Sometimes God will speak to you through circumstances. Whatever the circumstance you're in, whatever's happening around you, God is speaking to you through that. Sometimes it's through circumstances. Sometimes we don't like this, it's through consequences. It's through God punishing us, or our sin, because of the sin that we have done, allowing us into the punishment that happens because of our sin. Sometimes the consequence we face is how God's speaking to us. I remember when we were deciding to plant Impact Church, I really struggled on knowing whether God was calling me to do this, or whether it was just me wanting to do it. I couldn't really figure it out. So I met with a mentor of mine, and I was telling him, like, I'm not sure. I think God's telling me this, but how do I really know that? And he said, all right, let me ask you a couple questions. This has been something you've been thinking about for a while. Like, you felt like this something's been in your heart. It's like, yeah, it's been years. I've been thinking this would eventually happen. I said, okay, that's good. Your personality type and the way you work, do you think that you are semi-qualified to this? You're not qualified, but are you semi-qualified? Like, you have some of the characteristics you'll need in order to do this. I said, I think I do. I don't have all of them, but I think I have some. I said, okay. When you tell people around you, like the people that are close to you, your family, your friends, the people that know you the most, do they say that's a bad idea, or do they say, yeah, I could see that? I would say, yeah, they affirm it. I say, okay, has any doors opened up for you in this opportunity? Like, has any church showed up and said, hey, we want to do this? Has that happened? And I was like, yeah, some doors open up. So he said, you know what? Then you know as much as you're going to know. Take a step in faith. And that's what we need to know sometimes. Sometimes we need that person, like my mentor told me, about to tell us what is happening, to listen. We need that sometimes. Listen for God to speak. Now, you may not like what he says, but you need to listen. And after you listen, you wait. Habakkuk complains to God, and then he listens. And here's how God responds to his complaint, verse 3. These things I plan won't happen right away. Slowly, steadily, surely, the time approaches when the vision will be fulfilled. If it seems slow, do not despair, for these things will surely come to pass. Just be patient. They will not be overdue a single day. So when you are here, chapter 2, when you are here in the dip, you got to this crisis of belief, and you complained to God. You said, God, what is happening? I'm questioning you. Keep waiting. And I promise you, it's going to get worse. And you're going to get to a point where you're like, God, I don't know where you are. If you are here in chapter 2, listen and wait. Listen and wait for God. When you are in the dip, wait for him. Because eventually, we will get to chapter 3. And in chapter 3, we see worshiping. See, Habakkuk cries out to God. God answers, but not the way Habakkuk wants him to answer. Habakkuk complains about the answer, but he doesn't lose his faith. He doesn't lose his faith. He complains, but he doesn't lose it. And God says, listen, it's going to happen the way it's supposed to happen. I'm telling you, it's going to happen the way I intended it. Habakkuk, he responds with worship. It says this in verse 2. Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in all of your deeds. O Lord, renew them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. If you read Habakkuk and you read chapter 3, it says that this is supposed to be written in song, verse 2. That you're supposed to sing this. That's what Habakkuk is doing in verse 2. So if we are here, if you feel like you're in the dip, you're in that point in life where we all get to at times, how do we get out of it? I'm going to give you 3 ways really quickly on how we get out of the dip. The first one, remember what God has done. In Habakkuk's worship of God, he starts recounting everything that God has done in the past. Everything he's done with the Israelites. He starts talking about how God freed the Israelites from slavery. He starts talking about all the plagues that God sent. He talks about the promised land. Here's what he says in verse 4. He says, his splendor was like the sunrise. Rays flashed from his hand where his power was hidden. Plague went before him. Pestilence followed his steps. He stood and shook the earth. He looked and made the nations tremble. The ancient mountains crumbled and the age-old hills collapsed. His ways are eternal. When you are here, when you are in the dip, remember what God has done. There are times where I've been in the dip, and I would just think back on all the times I do remember God showing up. Because I'm in a moment where I feel like he's not there. So I would sit, and I'll think back of all the times I feel like God showed up for me in the past. I think about the first tithe check I ever wrote. First time I wrote a 10% tithe check. And it was a whole lot of money because I was working at Sbarro's at Arundel Mills Mall, and I did not have any money to my name. I remember writing that check. A couple weeks later, my dad called me saying, you got your tax return back, and it was almost the same amount, just with an extra zero on it. I remember that. I remember that like it was yesterday. I remember years and years of failing when it came to my dating. The girls that I liked didn't like me back. The girls liked me, I wasn't interested in. Year after year after year, just being like, God, that person, until I had a housewarming party and I met my wife, Erica. I remember that. I remember the birth of all three of my kids who are all different, but all very much Erica and I at the same time. I remember that the blessing that they are and still are. I remember the times when I would parent them and I would reflect on the fact that me as a dad, the feeling that I have and that emotion that I had that I never felt before, just created something different once you had that first kid, and every kid had changed a little bit. I remember having that feeling like, oh, this is a glimpse of what the God of the universe thinks of me. I remember that. I remember starting this church, and I remember feeling like we were by ourselves. I remember feeling like we had no one to help us. We had no money. I remember that. And I remember people jumping on board and saying, no, we're going to be part of this with you. I remember churches saying, no, we're going to support you financially. We're going to give money. We raised $50,000 from churches that gave out of their own pocket for us to start this church. I remember that. I remember when we used to be at Sykesville Middle School, and then they told us that basketball was going to be starting back up, so we had to go from the gym all the way down to the basement. I was like, okay, here's the thing. The basement is underneath the gym. When basketball starts, are we going to hear that? And the janitor went, oh, you're going to hear that. So if you think it's bad, these kids there, imagine a basketball being dribbling the whole time I'm trying to preach. We're like, well, we can't do that. So then we start desperately looking. I'm emailing people. I'm like, we can't be here. We got to go somewhere else. And we eventually found this place. I didn't want to move. That was our third move in a single year. I would go to different meetings with different pastors. They'd be like, man, you guys move a lot. I'm like, well, I don't want to. I don't like moving. We eventually moved here, and I remember that, and I remember not being happy the fact we had to move again. I remember that. But then a pandemic happened, and every church that was in a school could not go back into school for over a year. We weren't in a school anymore. We were here. I remember that. I remember praying with people for healing. I remember seeing people be healed while praying. I remember that. So in those seasons when I'm here, I try to remember what God has done. So you remember. It doesn't have to be these huge life-changing events. It could be simple things of things you prayed about that happened. It could be simple things of just a verse stuck out to you or a sermon that you were at that all of a sudden connected with you. Just remember it. Remember what God has done if you're in the dip. How do we get out of the dip? Number 2, we accept what God is doing. We remember and we accept. When you are in the dip, acknowledge it. Understand it. Accept it. This is important because too many of us, we start going, you know what, I'm just going to believe in a miracle instead of accepting what God has told you. It's kind of like having your head in the sand, and I see people do this all the time. If the doctor tells you that you need to get healthier or you're not going to make it, you need to get healthier and you're not going to make it. Instead, some people, they just put their head in the sand. You know what, I'm just going to pray for healing because I know God is a good God. I'm going to keep living my life, but I'm just going to pray that God shows up. No, that's not accepting it. You need to accept that you are in the dip. If your marriage is in trouble and your spouse keeps bringing up counseling, instead of just going, well, I'm going to pray that this all works out eventually, that's putting your head in the sand. No, accept what it is, understand it, and move forward. If your finances are really bad, but you want that new car, accept the fact that your finances are bad and you might not be able to afford that. Don't put your head in the sand and go, it's all going to work out. I trust that God is a God who provides. No, accept it, accept what God is doing, and move forward. When the storms in life come, don't put your head in the sand. And don't pretend it isn't real. Accept it. Accept that you are in the dip. Accept whatever it is God is walking you through. Do we pray for a miracle? Of course we do. You continually pray for a miracle. You pray that something will happen, that something will change. We continue to pray, but we need to accept what God is doing. Listen to how Habakkuk accepts it in verse 16. It says, I heard, as in he heard what is going to happen. He understood it. And let's look how he responds. I heard, and my heart pounded. My lips quivered at the sound. Decay crept into my bones, and my legs trembled. He's having a panic attack. He understood, he accepted the fact that God was going to send the Babylonians to take care of the people of Judah. These wicked people that were way more wicked than Judah, he was going to send them. He accepted it, and he started to freak out about it. Habakkuk here is realizing that what God said was going to happen is actually going to happen. He knew that people were going to lose their lives. He knew that he could lose his life. But Habakkuk trusted God even when he didn't fully understand, which leads us to number 3. How do we get out of the dip? Trust. You trust what God will do. You trust. If we want to have chapter 3 faith, we need to remember, we need to accept, and we need to trust. Habakkuk doesn't like what's happening. He doesn't agree with God here. But listen to how he responds at the end of chapter 3, the end of Habakkuk. Chapter 3, verse 17. Yet I will wait patiently for the day of calamity to come on the nation invading us. Though the fig tree does not bud and there are no grapes on the vine, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. Even though I have no reason to rejoice, yet I will rejoice. Listen, some of you are here, and you are thinking, you know what, my spouse said, till death do us part. But it doesn't feel like that's what's going to happen. My marriage is struggling. I'm in the dip. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. Some of your finances are struggling. I'm not sure what's going to happen. I'm not sure we're going to have enough. Yet, I will rejoice in the Lord. That doctor called, gave you some bad news. You're not sure what's going to happen. You're praying for healing, but you're not sure if it's going to happen. Yet, I will rejoice in the Lord. Your kids are not going down the path you want them to. You've tried everything. You raise them the way you're supposed to, but they have their own free will. They have their own choice. And you see where they're going, and you don't know if you can do anything, and you're worried about your kids. Yet, I will rejoice in the Lord. I do not understand. I don't like it. I don't get why God's doing it this way. Yet, I will rejoice in the Lord. That is what we are called to do. To have that type of faith. Yet, even in the midst of all these storms, even in the midst of all of this, I will rejoice in the Lord. And my prayer for you today is that at some point, you can get here. But you'll never get there until you go through this. Yet, I will rejoice in the Lord. You cannot get to chapter 3 faith without chapter 1 questioning and without chapter 2 waiting. That's why Habakkuk ends with this verse, the last verse in the book of Habakkuk. It says this, the sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like feet of the deer. He enables me to go on the heights. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. My faith in the past 10, 20 years has grown. But it hasn't grown just from here and just growing. Faith that I see grows, this is how it looks. That season, that crisis of belief, that season of waiting, it's like this. That's how God grows our faith. He doesn't grow up by just giving you everything you want, by making sure your life is always perfect, that never go through any troubles, never go through any storms. No, This is how our faith has grown. Habakkuk ends with the Babylonians taking over Judah. It happens. The thing Habakkuk didn't want to happen, it happened. The one thing he was praying about, God, don't let this happen, it happened anyways. Yet, I will rejoice in the Lord. My prayer for you all is that you can get to the heights of your faith. But you're going to have to go through the dip. I've experienced enough of God's faithfulness of my yesterdays that I can trust him with my tomorrow. And that's what I hope for you. So the way I want to close, I'm going to ask the worship team to come on up as we get ready to close. I want to close today by remembering why we have the hope that we have. The hope that we have is through the grace of God. And the grace we have is because of the death of Jesus Christ. So today, the way I want to end today, I want to end this service, is by taking communion together. In the back, they're going to have the communion stuff ready.